The weight of snow. The tracks in the snow were wrong. That's what Marcus Thompson noticed first. Not the size, though they were massive, easily twice as long as his own boot prints and deep enough that whatever made them had to weigh 3, maybe 400 pounds. No, what got his attention was the pattern. 5 toes. Human-like. But no human walked these mountains barefoot in December, and no human left prints that looked like they'd been pressed into the snow by something that understood weight distribution the way a person does. Marcus stood there on his porch, 72 years old, with a bad hip and hands that shook more than they used to, staring at those tracks like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. They just led from the tree line to his chicken coop and back again, a straight, purposeful line that spoke of intention rather than wandering. He'd been alone up here for 15 years now, ever since Linda passed. The isolation suited him, or maybe he'd just gotten used to it the way you get used to any pain if you carry it long enough. His cabin sat 12 miles up a logging road that barely existed anymore, the kind of place where silence had weight, and the only visitors were the mail carrier once a week, and his own memories every damn night. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you how a retired postal worker ended up facing something that would make him question everything he thought he understood about what lived in these mountains. Because this changes everything you think you know about being alone. Now, here's the thing about getting old in the wilderness. You learn to read signs the way some people read books. A bent branch means deer passed through. Scat tells you what's hunting and when. The way birds go quiet warns you about weather or predators. Marcus had spent enough time out here to speak that language fluently, but these tracks, they were a sentence in a language he'd never learned, and the grammar of them made his skin crawl. Before we dive deeper into what Marcus found that December, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. This channel is all about real stories that'll make you question what's out there. And trust me, after hearing what happened to Marcus, you're gonna want to stick around for more. The morning those tracks appeared was the same morning Marcus realized winter had finally decided to show up for real. October had been strange that year. Warm when it should have been cold, the leaves holding onto their green like they were confused about the season. His tomatoes kept producing well into November, and the chickens 6 Rhode Island Reds, he'd named after Linda's sisters, though he'd never admit that out loud, kept laying like it was still summer. Even they seemed puzzled by the weather, clucking at each other in a way that sounded like questions. The old-timers down in Millbrook had been predicting a hard winter. They always did, their prophecies delivered with the certainty of men who'd seen enough seasons to recognize patterns in the chaos. But this time felt different. Every trip down the mountain for supplies, Marcus heard the same warnings delivered with increasing urgency. Stock up early. Get your firewood cut. Make sure your roof can handle heavy snow. The kind of talk that makes you pay attention even when you've heard it all before. So he'd prepared, cut more wood than usual, stacked it under tarps near the house where he could reach it even in deep snow, filled his root cellar with preserved vegetables, canned goods, emergency supplies, made sure the generator worked, though the damn thing was almost as old as he was and just as reluctant to start on cold mornings. Bought extra feed for the chickens, extra batteries for the radio, extra everything. Looking back now, it was like some part of him knew, some animal instinct that humans have forgotten how to listen to, except in moments when forgetting might cost you your life. The temperature drop came on a Tuesday. Marcus remembered because Tuesday was when the mail came, and the carrier, young guy named Tyler, couldn't be more than 30, had mentioned it. Weather service says we're in for it, he'd said, handing over a package of prescription medications and a seed catalog Marcus hadn't ordered but Linda used to love. Big storm rolling in from the west. They're calling it a once-in-a-decade event. Marcus had nodded, signed for the package, watched Tyler's truck disappear down the logging road in a cloud of dust that hung in the unseasonably warm air. By evening, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees. By Wednesday morning, there was ice on the water bucket, and the wind had teeth. December hit them like a fist. 3 weeks in, they'd already had more snow than most winters saw total, and the weather service kept talking about this massive system moving in, something they were tracking like it was alive and had intentions. Marcus did what he'd always done, checked his supplies, stacked extra wood by the door, made sure the chicken coop was secure. But his bones knew something his mind didn't want to accept yet. The storm arrived on a Monday evening. He remembered the exact time because he'd been listening to the radio 8 o'clock, right when the news ended and the weather report came on. They were still talking about it, like it might change course, might lose strength, might be less severe than predicted. But Marcus could feel the air pressure dropping, could taste the storm in the back of his throat like metal. His hip ached in that specific way that meant serious weather, and the chickens had stopped their evening chatter, gone silent in a way that felt ominous. By 9 o'clock, the wind started picking up. By 10, he couldn't see the chicken coop from his kitchen window. The transformation was incredible and terrible. What had been steady wind became something furious, something that screamed around the corners of the cabin and threw snow against the windows hard enough that he worried the glass might break. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees at sunset, below zero by midnight, and falling still. Even with the fire going full blast and every lamp lit, cold crept through the walls like something living, something patient and hungry. The power died at 2 in the morning. Not unusual for up here, but the timing felt personal, like the storm wanted him alone in the dark. He had candles, oil lamps, enough light to see by. But the house started losing heat fast without the electric heater, and no amount of wood in the fireplace seemed to make a difference. The cold had physics on its side. It just kept coming, kept taking, kept winning. Sleep was impossible. Trees cracked like rifle shots in the darkness, their death throes echoing through the mountains. Something kept banging against the side of the house, probably a loose shutter or a branch. But in the dark, with the wind screaming, it sounded deliberate. It sounded like something trying to get in. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus heard something different. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't trees breaking. It was rhythmic, purposeful. A thumping against the back wall that came in sets of 3, then stopped, then started again. He grabbed his flashlight, a heavy mag light he'd carried since his postal days, and checked every window he could reach. But the snow was coming down so thick it was like looking at a white wall. He couldn't see 3 feet beyond the glass. The thumping continued for 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. Marcus stood in his kitchen, flashlight in one hand and his grandfather's hunting knife in the other, listening to nothing but wind and his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. His hands shook, and not from the cold. By dawn, the storm had settled into a pattern. The wind would howl for 10 or 15 minutes, reaching a crescendo that made the cabin groan and shift on its foundation, then calm down to almost nothing before picking up again even stronger. During one of those calm moments, Marcus managed to force the front door open against the snow that had drifted against it. The world had been erased. Everything he knew, the path to the woodpile, the clearing where he parked his truck, the chicken coop had vanished under snow that was already 3 feet deep and showed no signs of stopping. His truck was just a white mound, barely recognizable as a vehicle. The chicken coop was half buried in a drift, but he could hear them inside, clucking anxiously. At least they were alive. He couldn't reach them. The snow was too deep, the wind too strong. He'd have to wait for the storm to pass, then dig them out. If they survived. If he survived. Wednesday was worse than Tuesday night. The snow came down so fast and thick that visibility dropped to 0. Marcus couldn't see his own hand when he held it out in front of his face. The wind wasn't just moving air anymore. It was a physical force that pushed and pulled at everything, trying to find weaknesses, trying to tear things apart. The temperature kept dropping. 10 below 0, 15, 20. He fed the fire constantly, burning through wood faster than he'd planned. The cold was relentless, seeping through every crack and gap in the cabin's walls, no matter how much he fed the flames. His breath came out in clouds, even inside the house. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't terrifying evidence of how cold it was getting. By Thursday morning, Marcus had accepted that this wasn't a normal storm. This was something else, something old and angry, and determined to reshape the landscape into something humans didn't belong in. The snow was past 4 feet now, with drifts twice that height. The chicken coop had vanished completely. He couldn't hear them anymore. Thursday night, he heard the crying. It cut through the wind around midnight, high-pitched, desperate, unmistakably alive. Not human, but not quite animal either. Something in between. Something that made every hair on his body stand up, and his hands go still on the poker he'd been using to tend the fire. The sound came again. Closer this time. Not words, but meaning was clear. Distress, fear, pain. The kind of sound that bypasses logic and goes straight to whatever part of the brain evolved to recognize suffering in others. Marcus knew he should stay inside. Knew it absolutely, the way you know fire burns and water drowns. Going out into that storm was suicide. The temperature was 20 below, maybe worse with the wind chill. Visibility was zero. He could get turned around in seconds, lose sight of his own cabin, freeze to death 10 feet from his door. Plenty of people died that way, experienced outdoorsmen who thought they could handle it, who thought they knew better. Pride's a hell of a thing, and the mountains don't care about your confidence. But the crying continued, and Marcus found himself pulling on his heaviest coat before his mind had fully committed to the decision. Layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirt, wool sweater, down coat, waterproof shell over all of it, insulated boots, 2 pairs of gloves, balaclava, goggles. He tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to the porch railing old mountaineer's trick. If he got lost, he could follow it back. The cold hit him like a physical blow when he opened the door. It wasn't just cold, it was aggressive, attacking any exposed skin with claws of ice. His goggles frosted over immediately. The wind tried to tear him off the porch. Snow drove at him horizontally, each flake hitting like a tiny projectile. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe without the cold stabbing his lungs, couldn't hear anything but wind. For a moment, Marcus considered going back inside. This was insane. Whatever was out here would have to survive on its own. Then he heard the crying again, so close it had to be just beyond his porch, and his feet were moving before his brain could raise objections. 3 steps into the snow, and he was in water over his knees. The cold bit through his pants immediately, finding skin, making his bad hips scream. 4 more steps, and he nearly fell, catching himself on nothing but luck and old reflexes that shouldn't have been as quick as they were. The rope around his waist pulled taut. He'd reached the end of his tether, 40 feet from his door, and he might as well have been in a different world. The crying was to his left. He turned, squinting through frozen goggles, and saw nothing but white. Then movement, something small and dark against the snow, about 10 feet away. 2 somethings. Small enough to be children, except children didn't live up here and wouldn't survive 10 seconds in this cold. Marcus waded toward them, each step an act of faith that the ground would be there, that he wouldn't step into a hole or off an edge he couldn't see. His hands had gone numb already despite the gloves. His face felt like wood. The cold was stealing his breath, making his chest tight, his thoughts slow. He reached them. They weren't children. They weren't anything he had words for. Small, maybe 3 feet tall, curled together in the snow, covered in reddish-brown fur that was matted with ice. Faces that were almost human but not quite, with large eyes that caught what little light there was and reflected it back like a cat's. They were dying. He could see it in the way they moved, slow, lethargic, the life freezing out of them degree by degree. For several seconds, Marcus just stood there, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. His first thought was bear cubs, but the proportions were wrong. The faces were wrong. Everything about them was wrong, but in a way that felt more too right than incorrect. Like looking at something humans were supposed to forget about, but couldn't quite manage to erase from genetic memory. The larger of the two opened its eyes, impossibly large eyes, dark and aware, and made that crying sound again. Not begging, something more complex. A question maybe. Are you going to help, or are you going to watch us die? Marcus made his decision the way you make all important decisions, without thinking, letting something deeper than thought take the wheel. He bent down, scooped up the smaller one, tucked it inside his coat. It was heavier than it looked, solid muscle under that fur, but light enough that he could carry it. The other one was too big to carry with the first one already in his arms. He'd have to make 2 trips. The walk back to the cabin took forever, and no time at all. He could barely feel his legs. The rope guided him more than his eyes did, which saw nothing but white, and more white. The thing inside his coat was moving slightly, making small sounds that might have been distress, or might have been relief, or might have been something he didn't have the biology to understand. He practically fell through his door, stumbled to the fireplace, laid the small creature down on the hearthrug Linda had braided 15 years ago. It didn't move much, just curled tighter into itself, shivering in violent spasms that shook its whole body. No time to process. Marcus turned around and went back out into the storm. The second trip was harder. The cold had gotten its claws deeper into him, and his body was starting to shut down the way bodies do when they're losing the fight with hypothermia. His thoughts came slower. His movements were clumsy. The rope seemed longer than it had been, or maybe he was just moving slower. Hard to tell, hard to think. The larger creature was where he'd left it, barely visible in the snow that had already started to bury it. This one was too big to carry inside his coat. He tried to pick it up and nearly fell. His back seized old injury from the postal days, lifting too many packages wrong, but he got his arms under it, got it off the ground, started back toward the rope that meant home and warmth and survival. The storm fought him. The wind tried to tear the creature from his arms. Snow drove into his face hard enough to make his eyes water, and the tears froze on his cheeks. He couldn't feel the rope anymore, couldn't feel his hands, couldn't feel anything but cold and weight, and the fundamental need to keep moving, because stopping meant dying. The cabin appeared out of nowhere just suddenly there, in the white chaos. He somehow made it up the porch steps, through the door, collapsed just inside with the creature still in his arms. For several minutes, Marcus just lay there on the floor, trying to breathe, trying to convince his body it wasn't going to die just yet. His hands were white and waxy. His feet felt like blocks of ice inside his boots. His face hurt where the skin had been exposed despite the balaclava. But he was inside. He was alive. And he had two dying creatures on his floor who needed help if they were going to stay alive. The fire was his first priority, building it back up to something that could actually warm the room instead of just pretending to. He threw on logs with hands that barely worked, conscious that frostbite was a real possibility, that he might lose fingers if he didn't warm up carefully. But the creatures needed warmth, more than they needed careful. Once the fire was roaring, he turned his attention to them. The smaller one had stopped shivering, which was either very good or very bad. Marcus had seen enough hypothermia cases to know that when shivering stopped, you were either warming up or dying. He touched it gently. The fur was still damp and cold. Definitely still dying then. He grabbed towels from the bathroom, old ones Linda wouldn't have minded him ruining, and started drying them as best he could. The fur was thick and held water like a sponge. He worked carefully, not sure how fragile they were, not sure if they'd wake up and attack him, but they just lay there, breathing slowly, their bodies trying to process warmth they'd nearly lost the ability to recognize. The larger one was in worse shape. It had been exposed longer, and Marcus thought maybe it had used its body to shield the smaller one from the worst of the wind. Parental instinct maybe. Pack behavior. He didn't know, but it wasn't moving much, and its breathing was shallow. Marcus did what he knew how to do. He made warm sugar water not too hot, just lukewarm, and tried to get some into them using a clean cloth. The smaller one sucked at it weakly. The larger one didn't respond at first, and Marcus had a moment of thinking he'd gone out into a killing storm to bring back a corpse. Then its throat moved, swallowing, and relief hit him hard enough that his hands shook. He kept the fire going through the night, kept warming water, kept trying to feed them. Slowly, incrementally, they responded. The shivering started again, violent tremors that shook their whole bodies. Marcus wrapped them in blankets, in Linda's old quilts, in every soft thing he could find. The smaller one opened its eyes around 4 in the morning and looked at him with an awareness that made his breath catch. Intelligence lived behind those eyes. Confusion, fear, but also understanding that he was helping, that he was safe. By dawn, they were both breathing easier. The storm was still raging outside, still trying to tear the world apart. But inside his cabin, Marcus had managed to hold back death for two creatures that shouldn't exist. He sat by the fire, exhausted, his body screaming from the abuse he'd put it through, and studied them in the growing light. They were impossible. Nothing in his 60 years of living in these mountains had prepared him for this. Bears, yes. Mountain lions, deer, elk, coyotes, he knew all of them. But these creatures were something else entirely. Something that lived in the spaces between what people knew and what they whispered about late at night. The smaller one made a sound, not crying anymore, something softer, almost like a purr. It looked at Marcus with those two large eyes and blinked slowly. He found himself smiling despite everything, despite the cold still seeping through his walls, despite the storm trying to bury his cabin, despite his entire understanding of reality being rewritten by two small creatures that shouldn't exist. "You're welcome," he said out loud, his voice hoarse from the cold and the fear and the effort. "Don't mention it." They stayed like that through Friday. The storm showed no signs of ending, but inside the cabin, a different kind of world existed. Marcus kept the fire going, kept warming water, kept trying to feed his unexpected guests. They responded slowly, growing stronger as the hours passed. The smaller ones started moving around, exploring the cabin with careful movements that spoke of curiosity and caution in equal measure. The larger one stayed closer to the fire, still recovering, but watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. Marcus found himself talking to them. Stupid, probably, but the isolation had already made him used to talking to the chickens, to the radio, to Linda's memory. Why not talk to creatures that might actually understand, even if they couldn't talk back? Storm should break tomorrow, he said, feeding more wood to the fire. Weather service said 3 days, maybe 4. We're on day 3 now. Then I've got to dig out, check on the chickens if they're still alive. Make sure my truck still starts. The larger one watched him as he talked, its head tilted in a way that seemed attentive. Marcus wondered what it thought about him, about being rescued by something that was probably as strange to it as it was to him. Did they have stories about humans? Warnings passed down through generations? Stay away from the tall ones who build structures and burn fire. Friday night, the smaller one climbed into his lap while he sat by the fire. Just walked over and settled there, like it was the most natural thing in the world, its weight warm and solid and real. Marcus froze, not sure what to do, afraid of startling it, but it just curled up and made that purring sound again, and something in his chest that had been tight since Linda died loosened just a fraction. You're a brave little thing, he said quietly, carefully resting one hand on its back. The fur was dry now, thick and soft, probably braver than you should be. Probably gonna get yourself in trouble being too trusting. The larger one watched this interaction with what Marcus could only describe as parental concern. Protective, but allowing it. Like a mother watching her child approach a stranger, ready to intervene but giving them space to learn. The intelligence in that look was undeniable. These weren't just animals operating on instinct. These were beings with thoughts, feelings, social structures that paralleled human complexity. Saturday morning, the storm finally broke. Marcus woke to silence, the absence of wind so profound, it was almost painful. He'd grown used to the constant howl, the way the cabin creaked and groaned under the assault. Now, nothing but the soft crackle of the fire and gentle breathing from his 2 guests who'd settled near the hearth. He went to the window and scraped away the ice. Sunlight, actual sunlight. The first he'd seen in days cut through gaps in the clouds like something holy. The world outside was transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow had buried everything. His truck was completely gone under a drift. The trees were bent under the weight, some broken, some just bowing like supplicants before an angry god. And the tracks. God, the tracks. They came from the forest, enormous prints that made his earlier observation about wrong seem insufficient. These weren't just big. They were massive, adult-sized, maybe 9 or 10 inches long, pressed deep into the snow. They led straight to his cabin, stopped at the porch, then circled the entire structure before leading back into the trees. Something had been here during the night, something looking for what he'd taken. Marcus stood at his window, his coffee gone cold in his hands, and understood that he was living on borrowed time. Whatever these creatures were, they had family. They had parents who'd been searching for them in a storm that should have killed everything. Parents who'd found the trail to his cabin. Parents who now knew where their children were. The larger of his guests appeared at his elbow, moving so quietly he hadn't heard it approach. It looked out the window at the tracks, then up at Marcus, and in its eyes he saw recognition. It knew those prints, knew what they meant. They're coming back, Marcus said. Aren't they? The creature made a sound low, complex, musical almost. Then it moved to the door, stood there waiting like a dog that wanted out. Marcus's heart hammered. He wasn't ready to give them up, wasn't ready to face whatever had made those tracks, wasn't ready for any of this. But ready or not, the world had decided, and his vote didn't count for much. He bundled up not as many layers this time, since the temperature had risen to a balmy 10 degrees, and opened the door. The creature walked out onto the porch, snow coming up past its knees, but not slowing it down much. The smaller one followed, less confident, staying close to Marcus's legs. They stood there together, the 3 of them, looking at the forest. Waiting. The forest looked back. Movement in the tree line, barely visible. Then more movement. Then, stepping out into the clearing, with a grace that seemed impossible for something that size, it appeared. 8 feet tall, maybe more. Proportions similar to the young ones, but scaled up in a way that defied physics. covered in darker fur, almost black in the bright sunlight. Face that was both human and not, with eyes that held the weight of years Marcus could only imagine. It moved across the snow like it weighed nothing, each step purposeful and controlled. It stopped 30 feet from the porch, just stood there, watching, assessing. Marcus should have been terrified, should have run back inside, locked the door, grabbed his grandfather's rifle from the closet, but he didn't, couldn't. Something about the way the creature stood there, completely still, radiated not menace but restraint, power being deliberately checked, a predator choosing not to act. The two young ones called out sans Marcus had heard them make in the cabin, but different now, urgent, joyful. They moved down from the porch into the deep snow, wading toward the massive figure who waited for them with what Marcus could only describe as patience. The larger of the young ones reached the adult first. It didn't run or jump, or show fear, just walked up and stood there, and the adult bent down God. It had to be 9 feet tall when it straightened fully and touched the young one's head with careful fingers, checking, making sure it was real, and whole, and alive. The smaller one was more enthusiastic, making those purring sounds, trying to climb up the adult's leg. The creature picked it up with one massive hand, not paw, definitely hand, and held it close. And Marcus saw in that moment something that transcended species, a parent reunited with a child it thought lost. Marcus stood on his porch, useless and small, watching a reunion he'd made possible by being stupid enough to go out into a killing storm. His body ached from the effort. His fingers still hurt from the cold. His hips screamed at him. But watching this, watching these creatures who shouldn't exist, showing love and relief and gratitude, he'd do it again, would do it 100 times. The adult set the small one down carefully, then turned its attention to Marcus. For several seconds, they just looked at each other across 30 feet of snow and evolutionary distance. Marcus thought about running again, thought about getting inside, before this thing changed its mind about not killing him. But he didn't move, couldn't. It felt important to hold his ground, to show respect, to acknowledge what was happening. The creature raised one hand, a gesture so human it made Marcus's throat-tight palm forward. Not waving, not threatening, something else. Acknowledgement, recognition, maybe thanks. The ancient mathematics of debt and gratitude playing out between beings who couldn't speak each other's languages, but understood each other anyway. Marcus raised his own hand, mirroring the gesture. "Take care of them," he said, knowing it couldn't understand his words, but hoping it might understand his intent. "They're brave little things. Too brave. Keep them safe." The creature lowered its hand, gathered its young, and turned back toward the forest. They moved together, the larger one breaking trail through the deep snow, the young ones following in the path it made. At the tree line, the adult stopped and looked back one more time. Marcus couldn't read its expression, but he felt the weight of it anyway, the acknowledgement of what had passed between them. The understanding that some debts can never be repaid because they exist outside the economy of fairness. Then they were gone, melting into the forest like they'd never been there at all. Only the tracks remained, enormous adult prints, and smaller ones following in formation, evidence that something impossible had visited his porch and taken back what he'd saved. Marcus stood there for a long time, cold seeping back into his bones, trying to process what he'd experienced. The logical part of his brain insisted it hadn't happened. Hypothermia, induced hallucination, maybe, or cabin fever, or the first signs of dementia. But his body knew better. His aching muscles knew. The towels drying by the fire knew. The empty space in his cabin where two impossible creatures had slept knew. He went inside, locked the door, sat down by the fire that had kept them all alive. His hands were shaking again, but not from the cold this time. From the realization of what he'd done, what he'd seen, what he now knew existed in these mountains he'd thought he understood. The chickens. He needed to check on the chickens. Marcus spent the next 2 hours digging. His back screamed at him, his hip threatened mutiny, and his hands, still recovering from mild frostbite, blistered inside his work gloves. But the chickens were alive, all 6 of them huddled together in their coop, pissed off and hungry but breathing. He cleared the entrance, gave them fresh water and feed, and they clucked at him like he'd personally arranged the storm just to inconvenience them. "You're welcome," he muttered, watching them peck at the feed like nothing had happened. Like the world hadn't just been rewritten. The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and routine. The logging road wouldn't be passable for at least a week, maybe 2. The county didn't prioritize clearing roads that barely existed on maps. Marcus had enough supplies to last a month if he was careful. The generator worked when it felt like it. The chickens kept laying. Life continued the way it always did, indifferent to miracles and impossibilities. But Marcus couldn't stop thinking about them. The weight of the small one in his lap, the intelligence in those 2 large eyes, the way the adult had stood in his clearing, radiating controlled power, and something else, dignity maybe. The kind of presence that made you understand you were seeing something ancient and important, something that deserved respect on a fundamental level. He found himself watching the forest more carefully now, looking for signs, movement in the shadows between trees, tracks in the fresh snow, any indication that they were still out there, still aware of him. The logical part of his brain said they'd moved on, returned to wherever they lived, forgotten about the old human who'd pulled their young from a storm. But something deeper insisted otherwise. The first sign came 3 days after the reunion. Marcus woke to find his woodpile reorganized. Not dramatically. He might not have noticed if he wasn't paying attention, but the logs he'd stacked haphazardly in his rush to get inside during the storm were now arranged with more care. Neat rows, bark facing the same direction, pieces of similar size grouped together. The kind of organization that showed thought and purpose. He stood there in the morning cold, breath clouding, staring at firewood that had rearranged itself overnight, or been rearranged by something with hands and understanding of human needs. Something that knew he'd need that wood, that had made it easier for him to access with his bad hip and aging body. "Well," Marcus said to the empty clearing, "thank you, I guess." The forest didn't respond, but he had the distinct feeling he was being heard. More signs appeared over the following weeks. Small things, easy to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore collectively. The path he used to reach the chicken coop, always the same route, worn into habit, stayed mysteriously clear of snow even after fresh falls. Branches that had fallen across his trails were moved aside. Once, he found a pile of kindling on his porch, perfectly sized pieces of dry wood that would have taken him an hour to split and prepare. Most significantly, there were the offerings. They started appearing at the edge of his property where the cleared land met forest. Smooth river stones arranged in careful patterns, circles within circles, spirals that drew the eye inward. Bundles of dried berries, varieties he recognized as edible and nutritious. Pieces of bark, with intricate natural patterns, beautiful in the way random chance sometimes creates art. They showed up overnight, always placed where he'd see them during his morning routine. Marcus started leaving offerings of his own. Bread from his weekly baking, fruit from his pantry apples and oranges from his last trip to town. Once, a small pocket knife he'd found while cleaning out Linda's things, still sharp and useful. They were always gone by morning, though whether taken by his intended recipients or simply forest scavengers, he couldn't be sure. But he thought he knew. Hoped he knew. Winter deepened. January brought more snow, more cold, but nothing like that first storm. Marcus settled into a rhythm that felt different than before. The isolation didn't press on him the same way. The silence felt less empty. He'd catch himself talking out loud, more often not to himself exactly, but to an audience he couldn't see but sensed was there. Watching, listening, present in a way that made the mountains feel less like a place he'd retreated to, and more like a place he belonged. His hip bothered him less. Not healed, it would never heal. Not at his age, but manageable. Like something in his body had decided to cooperate a little longer, to give him more time. The shaking in his hands improved too. His doctor, on one of the rare occasions Marcus made it down to town, seemed surprised by how well he was doing for a man his age, living alone in the mountains. "Whatever you're doing up there, keep doing it," Dr. Martinez said, reviewing his charts with the skeptical expression of a man who distrusted good news. "Your blood pressure's better. Heart rate's steady. You look healthier than you did 6 months ago." Marcus didn't mention the impossible creatures he'd saved, or the sense of being watched over by something ancient and protective. Some things you kept to yourself, not because you doubted them, but because explaining would diminish them, make them small, turn mystery into misunderstanding. February brought the first real thaw. Temperatures climbed into the 40s, and the snow started its long retreat. Marcus spent more time outside, repairing winter damage, preparing for spring. The chicken coop needed new shingles where the weight of snow had stressed the roof. His truck needed a jump start after sitting idle for weeks. Ordinary tasks that felt profound after everything that had happened. He was working on the coop one afternoon, sunny and warm enough that he'd stripped down to just a flannel shirt when he heard them. Not the creatures. People. Human voices carrying through the forest, getting closer. Marcus straightened, his back protesting, and watched the tree line. 3 figures emerged onto his property, moving with the confident swagger of people who thought they owned whatever they were walking on. Young guys, maybe early 30s. Too young. They wore expensive outdoor gear that looked new, the kind city people bought before they decided to have an adventure in the wilderness. One carried a high-end camera with a telephoto lens. Another had what looked like audio recording equipment. The third led the way with a GPS unit in one hand and overconfidence in every step. "Hello," Marcus called out, his voice carrying that flat tone Linda used to call his dealing with idiots voice. "This is private property." The leader looked up, seemed surprised to see another human being, as if the cabin itself hadn't suggested someone lived here. He smiled too wide, too friendly, and changed direction to approach Marcus directly. "Hey there," he said, extending a hand Marcus didn't take. "Sorry to intrude. We're researchers, cryptozoologists. Tyler Anderson." He gestured to his companions. "This is Connor Blake and Josh Miller. We're investigating reports of unusual activity in this area." Marcus's stomach went cold. What kind of activity? Well, Tyler's smile got wider, like he was about to tell a great joke. "We've had reports of some unusual tracks. Large bipedal creature, possibly ape-like. We're documenting evidence of Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest." He said it proudly, like he expected Marcus to be impressed. "Haven't seen anything like that," Marcus said flatly. "Just me and my chickens up here." Sure. Tyler wasn't listening, too busy scanning the clearing with eyes that lingered too long on everything. "But you must have seen something. Storm that hit in December. Perfect time for sightings. Animals get confused, venture closer to human habitation. You're pretty isolated up here. Ideal location for an encounter." "Didn't see anything," Marcus repeated, his voice colder now. "And I'd appreciate it if you moved along. Like I said, private property." Connor, the one with the camera, had wandered toward the tree line and was crouching to examine something in the snow. "Tyler, come look at this." Marcus felt his heart kick into a higher gear. There were tracks there. He knew there were tracks there. The young ones had been visiting more frequently as winter wore on, growing bolder, playing in the clearing at night when they thought he was asleep. He'd watched from his window, careful not to disturb them, just observing their games and social interactions. They left prints, obvious prints. Tyler jogged over, and Marcus watched helplessly as they examined the evidence he should have covered up, should have hidden, should have protected. But how do you hide tracks in snow without leaving more tracks? How do you erase the evidence of trust? "Holy shit," Tyler breathed. "Connor, get pictures. Josh, audio notes. Document everything." Marcus walked over, his hips slowing him down, making him feel his age. By the time he reached them, Connor had his camera out and was snapping photographs from multiple angles. The tracks were clear, too clear. 5 toes, human-like proportions, the distinct pattern of something bipedal, a child's size. Exactly what these idiots were looking for. "These are on my property," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge he hadn't used in years. The voice from his postal days, when he dealt with aggressive dogs and aggressive dog owners. "You don't have permission to be here, and you sure as hell don't have permission to photograph anything." Tyler looked up, and his smile had shifted into something calculating. "Sir, with all due respect, if there's an unknown species living in these mountains, that's bigger than property rights. This could be the most significant zoological discovery of the century. Could be tracks from anything," Marcus countered. "Bears, raccoons, probably just patterns from branches falling in the snow. You're seeing what you want to see. These are clearly primate-like," Josh said, his recording equipment held up like it granted him authority. "The toe spread, the arch, the depth pattern suggesting bipedal locomotion. This is exactly what we're looking for." Marcus felt something building in his chest, anger mixed with fear, mixed with protective instinct he hadn't felt since Linda died. These men were threats, not to him, but to something more important. Something that had trusted him, that had shown him kindness, that existed in a space between reality and myth, that men like this would destroy with their cameras and theories and desperate need to be right. "Get off my property," Marcus said quietly. Now, Tyler stood up, brushing snow from his knees. We're going, but we'll be back. These tracks suggest there's an active population in this area. We've got grants to investigate, permissions from the Forest Service. You can't stop us from searching public lands, and most of this mountain range is public. He smiled again, and it was ugly this time. We're going to find them, document them, prove they exist. You can help, or not your choice. They left, following their GPS back into the forest. Marcus stood there watching them go, his hands shaking with something that had nothing to do with age or illness. They'd be back. They'd bring more equipment, more people. They'd set up cameras, audio recorders, maybe bait stations. They'd turn these mountains into a hunting ground, and what they were hunting didn't deserve to be found. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, trying to figure out what to do. Warning, the creatures seemed impossible. How do you communicate danger to beings you can't talk to? Destroy the tracks. Too late. They already had photographs, coordinates, evidence that would bring more searchers. Around midnight, he heard familiar sounds outside. The soft footfalls he'd learned to recognize, the gentle vocalizations that meant the young ones were visiting. He went to the window and saw them in the moonlight, both of them, noticeably bigger than they'd been in December but still juvenile, playing in the snow, wrestling, acting like children anywhere. Marcus opened the door carefully, not wanting to startle them. They looked up at his appearance but didn't run. The smaller one made that purring sound, almost a greeting. They'd grown comfortable with him, trusted him. You need to go, Marcus said quietly. Men came today. Bad men. They're looking for you. And if they find you, he didn't finish. Didn't know how to explain to creatures without human language what humans did to things they wanted to study. The cages, the laboratories, the cold scientific observation that turned living beings into specimens. Or worse, the trophy hunters, the people who'd kill something, rare just to prove they'd seen it. The larger young one tilted its head, watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Did it understand? Could it sense his fear? Animals could read human emotion through body language, pheromones, tone of voice. Maybe these beings, so much more advanced than simple animals, could read even deeper. Marcus stepped off his porch into the snow. The cold bit through his slippers, but he ignored it, moving closer to them. They didn't retreat. The smaller one actually approached him, reaching up to touch his hand with fingers that were surprisingly warm despite the temperature. Listen, Marcus said, crouching down to be more on their level, his hips screaming at him. I don't know if you understand me. Don't know if you can tell your family what I'm saying, but people are coming, dangerous people. They know you're here now. They've got pictures of your tracks. They're going to set up cameras, traps maybe. They'll wait as long as it takes. He touched the small one's head, felt the coarse fur that had been frozen and dying in his arms just months ago. You need to go somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere they won't find you. The young ones looked at each other, some communication passing between them that Marcus couldn't interpret. Then they looked back at him, and the larger one made a sound complex, layered, almost linguistic. Not quite words, but carrying meaning that transcended language. It felt like acknowledgement, like understanding. They moved then, together, back toward the forest. But at the tree line, they stopped. Both turned to look at him one more time, and Marcus felt the weight of that look in his chest. Gratitude maybe, or goodbye, or both. Then they were gone, and Marcus was alone again in his clearing, with nothing but tracks in the snow and the growing certainty that he'd just seen them for the last time. The next week proved him wrong. Tyler and his crew did return, along with 4 more people carrying enough equipment to outfit an expedition. They had permits. Marcus saw the paperwork giving them permission to conduct wildlife research on Forest Service land. His property was a tiny island in a sea of public land, and there was nothing he could do to stop them from working everywhere else. They set up a base camp about 2 miles from his cabin, close enough that Marcus could hear their generators at night when the wind was right, close enough that they'd occasionally hike past his property, always waving, always too friendly, always watching for signs of what they were hunting. Marcus started hiking the mountains more despite his hip, despite his age, despite the cold. He told himself he was just getting exercise, maintaining the trails, checking on familiar landmarks. But really, he was looking for signs of his friends, hoping to find evidence they'd listened and left, dreading finding evidence that Tyler's crew had found them first. March came in cold and stayed that way. The researchers seemed undeterred by the weather, by the lack of results, by anything resembling common sense. Marcus would see them sometimes distant figures, moving through the forest with their expensive cameras and unwavering belief that persistence would pay off. They'd found more tracks, he knew. He'd overheard them talking on one of the rare occasions they'd stopped by his cabin, asking to fill their water bottles. Lots of tracks, they said. A pattern of movement suggesting multiple individuals, possibly a family group. Marcus gave them water and nothing else. Not conversation, not information, not hope. They seemed to think his unfriendliness was eccentricity. The cranky old hermit who lived in the mountains. They had no idea he was protecting something more important than their research, more valuable than their proof. One evening in late March, Marcus was bringing in firewood when he saw a figure at the forest edge. Not one of the young ones. Bigger, much bigger. The adult he'd seen during the storm, or one like it. It stood just inside the tree line where the shadows were thick, almost invisible. But Marcus's eyes had gotten good at seeing what shouldn't be there, and he recognized the shape, the posture, the controlled stillness of something that could be dangerous but chose not to be. They looked at each other across 50 feet of evening air. Marcus set down his armload of wood carefully, straightened despite his complaining back. The creature didn't move, just watched, waiting for something. Marcus understood. He walked to the edge of his property, not quite into the forest, but close. Close enough that they could see each other clearly in the fading light. Close enough that the creature could kill him before he took 2 steps backward if it wanted to. But fear felt inappropriate somehow. Like bringing a weapon to a peace talk. "They're looking for you," Marcus said quietly. "Got cameras everywhere. Motion sensors. They're not going to leave until they find something or run out of money. Probably run out of money first. These academic types always do. But until then, you need to be careful." The creature tilted its head, that same gesture he'd seen in the young ones. Listening, understanding maybe, or at least trying to. Its eyes caught what little light remained, reflecting it back like a cat's tapetum lucidum. Adaptation for night vision. Evolution optimizing for a life lived in shadows. "I can't protect you," Marcus continued. "I'm just an old man with a bad hip and chickens. But I wanted you to know I didn't tell them anything. Didn't confirm the tracks were yours. Didn't help them at all. And I won't. No matter what they offer or threaten." The creature made a sound low, resonant, felt as much as heard. It vibrated in Marcus's chest, in his bones. Not aggressive, something else. The kind of sound that carried weight and meaning beyond simple communication. An acknowledgement of debt, maybe, or a promise. Hard to say when you're translating across the canyon of species. Then it was gone. Just melted back into the forest the way water soaks into earth there one moment, absent the next, leaving only the memory of presence and the certainty that something important had been exchanged. Marcus stood there as night fell around him, the cold seeping through his coat, his breath clouding white. Inside his cabin, the fire would need tending, the chickens would need checking, life would need living. But for this moment, he just stood at the boundary between his small circle of civilization and the vast unknown of the forest, feeling more connected to something ancient than he'd felt in years. April brought the researchers' departure. Marcus watched them pack up their base camp, load their equipment into trucks, and head back down the mountain towards cities and universities and funding committees who'd want explanations for the lack of concrete results. Tyler stopped by Marcus's cabin on their last day, looking tired and frustrated and younger than he'd seemed when he first arrived. "We found tracks," he said, leaning against Marcus's porch, railing without being invited. "Lots of tracks. Hair samples that don't match any known species in the database. Audio recordings of vocalizations that don't fit any documented animal. But no visuals, no clear photographs, no video evidence." He laughed, but it sounded bitter. "It's like they know where every camera is. Like they're avoiding us specifically." "Maybe there's nothing to find," Marcus offered. "Maybe you're seeing patterns in random data. People do that. Want something to be true so bad, they convince themselves it is." Tyler looked at him with eyes that had seen too many empty forests and not enough proof. "You've lived up here for 15 years. You're telling me you've never seen anything unusual? Never heard sounds you couldn't explain? Never found tracks that didn't make sense?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I've seen bears, cougars once or twice, lots of deer. raccoons in the garbage, coyotes. That's it. Normal mountain stuff. Nothing unusual. It wasn't exactly a lie. Those creatures weren't unusual, they were just unknown. There was a difference, though Marcus suspected Tyler wouldn't appreciate the distinction. Right, Tyler said, pushing off from the railing. Well, we'll be back next season. Better equipment, different strategy. We know they're here now. It's just a matter of time before we get the proof we need. Marcus didn't respond. Just watched Tyler walk back to his truck. Watched them all drive away down the logging road. Watched the mountain return to the quiet he'd grown to love. That night, he found an offering on his porch. A piece of quartz, maybe 4 inches long, naturally formed, but perfectly clear. It caught moonlight and fractured it into colors that shouldn't have been possible from plain white light. Beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. It sat right in front of his door where he couldn't miss it, placed with care and obvious intention. Marcus picked it up, felt the weight of it, the smoothness worn by water and time. A thank you, maybe, or a goodbye, or just recognition that 2 species had met in the wilderness and chosen kindness over fear. He kept it on his windowsill where the morning sun would hit it, where it could remind him that impossible things existed in the spaces between what people knew and what they wanted to prove, where it could be a small monument to the idea that some mysteries were better left unsolved, some secrets better kept. Spring unfolded like it always did. Snow melted into streams that rushed down the mountain. The chickens got bold and started wandering farther from their coop. Marcus planted his garden tomatoes, peppers, green beans, all the things Linda used to grow. His hip felt better. His hands shook less. The mountains held him like they always had, but gentler now, like something was watching over him, keeping him safe, letting him know he wasn't quite as alone as geography suggested. The signs continued. Small things, easy to dismiss but impossible to ignore. His trails stayed clear of fallen branches. The garden flourished beyond what his gardening skills should have produced. Once, when a bear got curious about his chicken coop, he found it scared off by something before he could even grab his rifle. The coop untouched, the chickens fine, but bear tracks leading away at a run like something had given it a reason to hurry. Summer brought wildflowers to the clearing around his cabin, more than usual, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random circles and spirals that reminded him of the stone arrangements he'd find at the forest edge. Marcus would sit on his porch in the evenings, drinking coffee that tasted better than it had any right to, watching the sun set over mountains that held secrets worth keeping. He started seeing them more regularly as the weather warmed. Never close, they'd learned caution, learned that humans with cameras and theories were dangerous in ways humans with kindness weren't. But he'd catch glimpses, movement in the forest at dusk, shapes that resolved into nothing when he looked directly at them, but stayed solid in his peripheral vision. The young ones, he thought, checking on him, making sure he was okay. Once, in July, he saw the adult again. It stood at the far edge of his property, just as the sun was coming up, massive and still in the early light. Marcus raised his hand, that same gesture from their first meeting. The creature raised its hand in response, held it there for a long moment, then turned and walked into the forest with a grace that something that size shouldn't possess. Marcus understood. They were saying goodbye, really goodbye this time. The researchers would return next season, and the season after that. The mountains weren't safe anymore, not for beings who needed to stay hidden. They'd move on, find somewhere more remote, more protected, somewhere humans hadn't yet decided to conquer with technology and persistence. He stood on his porch, watching the empty space where the creature had been, feeling loss settle in his chest like stones. But underneath the sadness was something else, gratitude maybe, or satisfaction, or just the quiet knowledge that he'd been part of something bigger than himself, something that would continue after he was gone. August burned hot and dry. Fire danger was high, and the Forest Service sent out warnings about no campfires, no smoking, extreme caution with any flame. Marcus respected fire the way you respect anything that can kill you. He'd seen forest fires before, knew what they could do when they got running, knew how fast they moved, how they jumped from tree to tree, how they turned air into something that burned your lungs just to breathe. The first smoke appeared on a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus smelled it before he saw it, that distinctive scent of burning wood that's wrong somehow, too big, too wild. He walked to the edge of his clearing and looked north. A column of smoke rose into the sky maybe 3 miles away, grey-white against the blue. growing. The wind was blowing south. Toward him, Marcus moved faster than he'd moved in years. Got the chickens into carriers, they protested, but he didn't have time for their opinions. Threw them in his truck along with a bag he kept packed for emergencies. Important papers, medications, Linda's wedding ring that he still couldn't throw away, a photo album. The essentials that defined a life lived. The smoke was getting thicker. He could hear it now, a distant roar like a freight train that never stopped. Fire had its own sound, its own voice. It spoke in the language of consumption and destruction, and it didn't negotiate. He should leave, should get in his truck and drive down the mountain as fast as the logging road would let him. The Forest Service would have evacuation orders out by now. This was exactly the scenario they warned about: fire, high wind, dry conditions. The kind of situation where people died because they waited too long, believed too much in their ability to outlast nature. But Marcus found himself walking toward the forest instead, toward where he knew they lived, or had lived, toward the beings who'd shown him kindness when they had every reason to fear him. "You need to run," he said to the empty trees, knowing they probably weren't there, knowing they'd probably already left. "Fire's coming, big one. It's going to burn everything." His voice sounded small against the growing roar. "Please, if you're still here, run." The forest didn't answer, just stood there being trees, being fuel, waiting for fire to make them into something else. Marcus went back to his truck, started the engine, but before he could put it in gear, movement caught his eye. The adult, emerging from the trees. It looked at him, looked at the smoke rising in the north, looked back at him. Understanding passed between them. Danger, urgency, the mathematics of survival. Then more movement. The whole family, the adult. What might be a mate? The two young ones who were nearly full-grown now, and two smaller ones Marcus hadn't seen before. 6 of them total. A family unit, all standing at the edge of the clearing, all watching the smoke, with what Marcus could only describe as concern. They knew. Of course, they knew. They'd lived in these mountains longer than humans had built cities. They understood fire's language better than any researcher with degrees and theories. They knew when to run. "Go," Marcus said, his voice rough. "Get out of here. Head east, winds coming from the west, pushing it south. Go east and you might have a chance." The adult looked at him one more time. Then it made a sound complex, musical, carrying meaning. Marcus felt more than understood. A farewell, maybe. Or a blessing. Or just acknowledgement that they'd met in the wilderness and chosen to be kind to each other when they could have chosen otherwise. Then they were moving. The family unit heading east through the forest, moving fast. The young ones keeping pace with practiced ease. Marcus watched them disappear into the trees, his chest tight with too many emotions to name. He drove down the mountain. Took his time because his truck was old and the road was rough, and rushing would just get him killed. The smoke got thicker. Ash started falling like grey snow. By the time he reached the paved road at the bottom, he could see flames on the ridgeline behind him, orange and red against the darkening sky, beautiful and terrible. The fire burned for 11 days, consumed 42,000 acres of forest, destroyed 3 structures, though none of them were occupied. The Forest Service called it contained on day 8, but it kept smoldering in the deep duff for 3 more days after that, burning underground like a secret. Marcus stayed in town, bunking with a church friend who had a spare room and didn't ask too many questions. He watched the news, saw aerial footage of the burn scar, tried not to think about what might have been caught in that inferno, tried not to imagine the family unit running through smoke and flame, tried not to picture the young ones falling behind, tried not to calculate their chances. On day 12, they let residents return to check their properties. Marcus drove up the logging road expecting nothing but ash and loss. The road was different now, widened by fire crews, cleared of the debris that used to make it barely passable. Easier access. More people would use it now. Progress disguised as pragmatism, his cabin stood untouched. Not just standing untouched. Like the fire had reached the edge of his property and decided to stop. The clearing around his cabin was green. His garden had survived. The chicken coop was fine. Everything beyond his property line was black and skeletal, but his little island remained. Marcus walked the perimeter, trying to understand. Fire didn't work this way. It didn't respect property lines or spare specific structures out of sentiment. It burned what it touched and touched everything. But here, on his land, the fire had stopped, had been stopped. By what? He found the answer at the tree line. A fire break, not a natural one, but one that had been constructed, earth piled up, cleared of vegetation, wet somehow, even though no rain had fallen. It circled his entire property, a deliberate barrier between the fire and everything he owned. Someone had built it. Something had built it. While fire raged through the forest, while Marcus sat in town watching news footage, something had worked to save his home. He stood there, looking at the fire break, looking at his cabin standing green and whole against a landscape of ash, and felt something break open in his chest. Gratitude, humility, the overwhelming weight of a debt he could never repay. That night, he found them. He'd been sitting on his porch, watching the sunset paint the burn scar in shades of orange and red, when he heard the familiar sounds. Cautious footsteps, soft vocalizations, the language of beings who'd survived what should have killed them. The family unit emerged from the forest, all 6 of them, covered in ash and soot but alive. The young ones looked exhausted. One of the adults had what looked like burns on its hands, but they'd made it. They'd survived, and they'd come back. Not to stay, Marcus understood that immediately. Just to check, to make sure he was okay, to see if the old human who'd pulled their young from a storm had survived the fire that had tried to take everything. Marcus stood up, his bad hip forgotten. "You're alive," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank God, you're alive." The adult with the burned hands moved forward. It carried something, a bundle wrapped in leaves. It approached the porch slowly, non-threatening, and set the bundle down on the bottom step. Then it stepped back, watching Marcus with those intelligent eyes. Marcus came down the steps carefully, bent to pick up the bundle. Inside the leaves was a collection of stones, quartz, agate, river rocks worn smooth by time and water. Beautiful things, precious things, a gift from beings who had nothing to give, except what nature provided and their choice to give it. "Thank you," Marcus said, looking up at the family. "For the fire break, for saving my home." For his voice broke again. "For everything." The adult raised its hand. That gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Marcus raised his own hand, mirroring it, 2 beings from different evolutionary paths meeting in mutual recognition. Then they were gone, back into the forest, or what was left of it. Marcus stood there holding his gift, watching the space where they'd been, understanding that this was truly goodbye. The fire had changed everything. The Forest Service would be here more often now, assessing damage, planning recovery, more people, more attention, less safety for beings who needed to remain hidden. They'd have to leave, find somewhere new, somewhere untouched, somewhere humans hadn't yet decided to study, or protect, or manage. Marcus put the stones on his windowsill next to the quartz they'd given him before. Light caught them, fractured into colors, painted his walls in tiny rainbows. Beautiful, precious, a reminder that he'd been part of something rare. September brought the researchers back. Not Tyler and his crew, they'd found funding elsewhere, chasing reports in Washington state. But a new group, better equipped, more determined. They'd heard about the unusual fire pattern, about structures being saved by mysterious fire breaks. They had theories, they had questions. They had all the confidence of people who believed evidence was the only kind of truth that mattered. Marcus gave them nothing. Claimed ignorance about the fire break, said it must have been Forest Service crews, though he hadn't seen them, suggested maybe the wind had shifted at exactly the right moment, offered explanations that were almost plausible if you didn't look too closely. They didn't believe him. He could see it in their faces, the way they looked at his cabin like it was evidence of something they couldn't quite prove. But belief wasn't enough. They needed facts. They needed photographs and DNA samples and peer-reviewed studies. They needed what Marcus would never give them. Days shortened. Fall came to the mountains, painting the surviving trees in colors that seemed defiant against the black landscape. Marcus settled back into his routine, fed the chickens, tended his garden, cut firewood for the coming winter. Small tasks that defined a life, lived simply. He was older now, could feel it in ways he couldn't ignore. His hip was worse after all the evacuation stress. His hands shook more. The doctor in town was making noises about assisted living, about it being time to consider moving somewhere with help nearby, somewhere safer for a man his age. Marcus wasn't ready. Not yet. The mountains still held him, still needed him maybe, or maybe he needed them. Hard to tell after 15 years of being part of the landscape. October brought the first hard frost. Marcus woke to find his garden killed overnight, the tomato plants blackened and wilted. The chickens huddled together for warmth. Winter was coming, like it always did. Life would continue, like it always did. The seasons would turn, indifferent to human dramas and impossible encounters. He was bringing in firewood one evening when he saw them one last time, not the family unit. Just the two he'd saved, young adults now, strong and healthy and alive because he'd been stupid enough to go into a storm. They stood at the forest edge in the twilight, watching him. He set down his wood and walked to meet them, each step a negotiation with his hip and age. They didn't run, just stood there, waiting. The smaller one made that purring sound, softer than he remembered, but still recognizable. The larger one watched him with eyes that held memory and something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or just acknowledgement of what had passed between them. "You're leaving," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. They both made sounds, complex vocalizations, that almost seemed like confirmation, like goodbye, like thank you and farewell, and we'll remember you, all wrapped into something humans didn't have the biology to fully express. Marcus reached out slowly, giving them time to move away if they wanted, but they didn't. He touched the smaller one's head, felt the same coarse fur that had been frozen and dying in his arms. Alive now, thriving, living the life it was meant to live, because one old man had chosen kindness over sense. "Be safe," he said quietly. "Stay hidden. Don't trust humans unless you absolutely have to. He paused, trying to find words. "We're complicated. Most of us mean well, but meaning well isn't enough sometimes." They stayed a moment longer. Then, as twilight deepened into night, they turned and walked into the forest, walked with purpose and grace into a wilderness that was shrinking every year but still held space for beings who needed to exist outside human understanding. Marcus stood there until he couldn't see them anymore, until the forest was just trees and shadows again, until the only evidence they'd ever existed was in his memory and the stones on his windowsill. He went inside, built up the fire, made coffee that would keep him up past midnight. But that was okay. Sleep felt less important than sitting with his memories, with the weight of what he'd been part of. The impossible thing he'd done, the impossible beings he'd met, the impossible kindness they'd shared across the canyon of species. Winter came. Marcus prepared like he always did, wood stacked, supplies stored, chickens secured. The researchers gave up as the weather turned. They'd be back in spring, they said. Always be back. Persistence was the key. Eventually, they'd get their proof. But Marcus knew better. The family was gone. Moved to somewhere safer, somewhere the cameras couldn't reach and the theories couldn't follow. They'd left behind only questions and the kind of evidence that could never quite satisfy the scientific method. Tracks that could be explained away. Sounds that could be attributed to known animals. Stories that sounded too much like wishful thinking or delusion. Perfect. That was perfect. Because some things were better left mysterious. Some beings deserved to live outside the harsh light of human scrutiny. Some secrets were meant to be kept by old men living alone in the mountains, sitting by their fires, touching stones that caught the light, remembering the impossible winter when everything changed. Marcus Thompson died 3 years later. Quietly, in his sleep, during a mild February night. The chickens found him the next morning when he didn't come out to feed them. The county sheriff drove up to investigate when the mail carrier reported no one answering the door for a week. They found a cabin in perfect order, wood stacked neatly, garden tools organized, everything clean and maintained, despite the occupant being a man in his mid-70s, living alone. On the windowsill, a collection of stones, quartz and agate, and river rocks. Beautiful in the way simple things sometimes are. No family to notify, no heirs to claim the property. The county took possession, eventually sold it at auction to a young couple from Portland who wanted a wilderness retreat. They moved in the following summer, full of plans to modernize and update, but they kept the stones. Something about them felt important, though they couldn't say why. They left them on the windowsill where morning sun would hit them and fracture into colors, where they could be a small monument to the previous owner, where they could remind anyone who looked that this place had history, had meaning, had been home to something more than just an old man and his chickens. Sometimes, late at night, they'd hear sounds in the forest. Not quite animal, not quite human. complex vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple communication. The husband would joke about Sasquatch. The wife would laugh and say it was probably coyotes. But sometimes they'd look at each other and wonder, and sometimes, in winter, they'd find tracks in the snow, large bipedal prints that led from the forest to the cabin and back again. 5 toes, human-like proportions, too big to be a person. They'd take pictures, post them online, get comments about hoaxes and misidentification and seeing what you want to see. But they never called researchers, never invited scientists with cameras and theories. Something stopped them, some instinct, some feeling that this mystery deserved protection rather than exposure, that whoever left those tracks had earned the right to remain unknown. They were right, though they didn't know why. And the creatures who visited the cabin at night, checking on the place where their children had been saved, where an old human had shown them kindness when he could have chosen fear, they recognized that protection. They understood what it meant, and on quiet winter nights, when snow fell soft and the world was reduced to whispers, you could almost hear them out there in the forest, singing maybe, or mourning, or just living the lives they were meant to live, wild and free and impossible, the way Marcus would have wanted, the way Linda would have understood, the way love works across any distance, any species, any boundary that fear tries to build between things that should know each other better.